This was going to be maybe a 5-minute portion of my Xenoblade Chronicles 2 review max, because all I expected this expansion to do was shed some light on past events gone over briefly in the main game, which was all it really needed to do. And that's exactly what Monolith Soft did, but in the process of doing so, created this compact experience with its own narrative, which works without outside context, while doing nothing but enhancing the story from Xenoblade 2, and fixing some other problems I had with it. While there isn't much going on in the core story itself, what surrounds this story, and what it culminates to, is what pushed me to dedicate a full video to this expansion, opposed to just being a portion of a much larger review. That's how much I enjoyed and was impressed by Torna. The combat. The combat in Xenoblade 2 is weird. I didn't hate it. At least not by the end of the game. At first I did, because it was very awkward trying to learn this combat style, which felt extremely foreign to me, having never played a Xeno game before, and no game prior with a similar combat system. It also didn't help how Xenoblade 2 introduces the combat to the player, as it does so very poorly, but that's something I'll cover next video. What Torna does is it takes what I would call the tedious combat from before and streamlines it. What do I mean by this? Well, in a nutshell, your goal of any fight is to unleash a chain attack to break elemental orbs you have added onto an enemy. Before, you would add an orb for every successful blade combo you would get off, which had to follow one of these flowcharts. Each step would require a blade special equal to or higher than the corresponding step, meaning you would need to do 3 blade specials which followed a specific sequence just for one orb. Maybe calling it tedious is a bit too negative, as it's more like it felt clunky at times, where fighting felt divided in parts of having to get this orb on, and now I'm going to try and get this other orb now, and hope the AI on my teammate doesn't decide to change their blade and screw up my plans, and so on. It would become nerve-wracking trying to manage this slow burn of adding orbs just to finally get a chain attack off, as you want to break as many orbs as possible with one chain, maximizing your damage with as little work as possible, if you will. Now, if you do any blade special, still having them increase in level with each step, you will be rewarded with an orb. The amount of work you had to do before just for one orb will now get you 3, assuming every blade special you did was of a different type, as you can't have more than one orb of the same type on an enemy. This one little change makes fights go by much faster, as now it's much easier to pump out those chain attacks, as you'll likely have tons of orbs on an enemy at any given time. One argument I see against this new system is how it's dumbing it down, as you don't have to think or obviously work as much as before, making fights much easier. There is merit to that argument, but at least for me, no longer having to micromanage my team as much while fighting provides a more fun experience, and with a game like this where I'm not here for a challenge, which I do appreciate, but for the story, not having to deal with dumb combat bullshit is preferable. That's actually something I'll go over in more detail in my next video, so for now we can just move on and talk about the other changes to the combat, which is the Vanguard switch. With the Vanguard switch, you can change between driver and blade for who is doing the attacking. This comes with its own share of benefits, such as healing, switch arts, and rearguard arts, all making combat far more dynamic thanks to the new options you have when fighting. And this is where I shift gears as well, because I could go in more detail on just what the Vanguard switch does to make combat more intricate, which if this is where a more in-depth review I would, but I would much rather focus on what really stood out to me about this feature. The Vanguard switch is an interesting new toy, which has its clear functions, but I saw something else which caught my attention. If there's one thing these games constantly bring up, it's the bond between driver and blade. This bond would show up during gameplay in 2 very minor ways before. The affinity chart, which unlocked more skills the more you used a blade, and this wavy light between you and your blade, which showed your affinity during combat, which came with some benefits once fully charged. Otherwise, your blade would just be standing there with their arms out, not doing much when fights are happening. But now with the Vanguard switch, you and your blade can take turns to attack the enemy, as if you are proper partners both helping each other out during these combat encounters. There will be many cutscenes in the original game, both showing Rex and Pyro/Mithra both tossing their sword around, taking shots at an enemy. And it would be this super fancy sequence, which obviously couldn't be replicated with how the combat works. But you still saw the teamwork at play there. And with how the combat in Torna is, it captures that sense of working as a team much better than before, even if it's nowhere near as flashy as the cutscenes make it out to be. I hope my weird way of talking about this mechanic makes sense, as it's a very unorthodox way to describe this feature. I think with how this game acknowledges it, and with how much this expansion focuses on character relationships, I do think this thought process of mine holds some water. As you'll soon see, this is just one of a few ways the expansion shines a spotlight on what I consider the theme of the game.
Oh, really? Well, that's just...
Oh, and passing the weapon. What a concept! How did you ever come up with that idea?
Oh, well... We were broke.
Huh?
We couldn't afford meals, let alone another sword. And so we made do.
Alright, from here on out, this is the juicy stuff. I talked about the combat and made my piece on why I enjoyed it so much, which is dandy and all. But what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the video is what made me realize that Torna was, really good. And the first of these things is something I should have expected going into this, but I just never really thought about, which is how this prequel gives us more details on certain characters whose past was brushed over to varying degrees in the main story. Which this should have been obvious to me, like duh, this is a prequel, this is going to go over those characters' past. This is significant because by seeing more of these three characters specifically, it makes them much stronger, much more developed, and in doing so makes the story of both of these games stronger as well. The first of these I want to go over is Jin, as he is by far the most important character when looking at the overarching story of Torna and Xenoblade 2, as he is the reason why the events of Xenoblade 2 even take place, because of what happens to him at the end of Torna. Assuming you have played these games, you know how Jin had a special relationship with Laura, and how this relationship's tragic end leads to Jin becoming the main antagonist later. Here in Torna, we get to see him very clearly hating this life cycle of being a blade, and how they return to the core crystal upon the driver's death, forgetting everything they experienced in that life. With Laura very quickly about to die, Jin absorbs her in some non-specific way so he could become a flesh eater. Now he has the powers of being a blade, with the disadvantage of being able to age like a human, like we get to see with Minnoth. But to Jin, this is not an issue, as now he can forever remember the time he spent with Laura. This is something the main story covered. It established Jin as a flesh eater, him having a very meaningful relationship with Laura, whose death then caused them to further resent the architect for creating this awful life cycle blades must go through. This backstory of his makes him a sympathetic villain, especially as he ends up dying right at the end of the game after using his last remaining power to kill Amalthus, who indirectly caused Laura's death. A major problem I had with Xenoblade 2 was Jin, and how I did not care for him that much, despite the game doing its best to make me care about him. Xenoblade 2, even with telling us all this information, did not do enough for me to grow emotionally attached to him. I blame this on the fact on how, 1, we don't get too much into the specifics of Jin's relationship with Laura, and 2, we barely even knew who Laura was. This is understandable, as Xenoblade Chronicles 2 is a big game with tons of things to cover, character interactions, story bits, and so on, and some stuff will simply be brushed over in favor of other things, with 2 of them being Jin's past and Laura herself. But this is what prequel expansions are for, and exactly what Torna fixes, giving us that clear picture of just how much this relationship meant to Jin. The flashbacks we saw during the main story, we now get the full context behind them, and so much more. All this time we now get to spend with them makes their tragic fates all that more impactful. We finally get to know who Laura actually was as a person, and why her death left Jin such an emotional wreck, to the point where he ends up teaming up against the very person him and Laura fought against in this DLC, because his worldview became so skewed to where immoral actions were justified. The other beneficiary from this added screen time is Hayes, or Fan Lenore as she's referred to in the base game. She shows up right around halfway through the game, and dies soon after she is introduced, at the hands of none other than Jin. By that point, we had already gotten a flashback showing both being Laura's former blades, so Jin killing his former partner is extremely surprising, though there was a reason for it. For you see, during the events of Xenoblade 2, Hayes is one of the blades under control of a Malthus. The moment Jin absorbed Laura and became a flesh eater, Hayes ends up going back to her core crystal, as Laura is officially dead at that point. A Malthus then finds her crystal and ends up becoming her driver. Jin, knowing this during the events of Xenoblade 2, kills her to free her of being under the control of the one responsible for this whole mess. Right after dying, Jin explains the fate blades suffer of not able to remember their past, alluding to how at that moment, Hayes had no idea she and Jin were former comrades, and why him killing her was freedom of this imprisonment she was unaware of. When I initially watched this, it was tragic, but I didn't feel anything, as I didn't get to know Hayes that well in the short time she was with us during Xenoblade 2. But after playing through Torna, I got to see all this time in which the two were happily working together under Laura, just being friends, you know. I can't stress enough just what a little more screen time can do for your appreciation of a character, to where I can go from feeling nothing from their death to getting legitimately emotional now, and this applies to both Jin and Hayes. Not to go for a cheap jab here, but this was something the Breath of the Wild Champions Ballad was missing, which I went over in my now deleted review for that game. Just giving us enough time to really appreciate these characters who we know end up with tragic fates. And I don't mean to keep this emotional train going, but I must finish this section by talking about Mithra. Mithra is very much like Jin, in how both characters we had enough information about their past to get a clear enough picture on how their past affected them to how they are now. Jin is a tale of revenge, and Mythra is one of dealing with PTSD. Unlike Jin, Mythra was a character I already enjoyed for reasons I'll likely go into next time, so in my eyes, she didn't need extra development, and she was perfect already. No, but seriously though, her tragic backstory on being responsible for Torna's sinking and killing hundreds of people on it made her far more interesting than her red counterpart, and having to deal with this massive trauma was enough for me to get on board with this character, who unlike Pyra didn't just feel like a walking pair of fanservice. I said it, but more on that next time like I just mentioned. Here in Torna, we quite literally get to see how this immediately impacts Mythra. So much so, she creates Pyra and goes into hibernation to no longer have to deal with wielding all this power. This would have been enough to show, but we get further development with her, as back then she wasn't just a tsundere, she was just a shitty person in general. No empathy, full of herself, lacking tact. She has come a long way since.
Oh no.
Here too. Gormot's an attractive target, but this... Whoever did this clearly had no compassion or respect for the people they killed.
Well, whether it was Malos or someone else, either way, clearly they're all toast.
Mithra,
The game acknowledges this change in character through a progression tree as well, with this one skill up here only able to be unlocked once you max out your community, meaning that through helping many people, Mithra finally learned to care for others. If you have a keen memory, you would also recognize this skill being in her progression tree in the base game as well, which is a nice touch to show Mithra's character development. While circling the topic of Mithra's body count, this is the perfect time to go over this DLC's story and how side quests tie into it. The story itself is quite simple. Malos is planning some evil scheme, and you go stop him with Zeke's and Rex's love child and Morak's brother. The story is more of a vehicle to learn about the cast that we have here, like I've been going over, and this includes the many NPCs populating the two titans we get to explore. This is relevant because at 2 points in the story, the game forces you to have a certain level of community to progress. Community being the NPCs you have helped out so far. You raise it by doing side quests, and if you haven't been doing them, that means having to do a ton of quests all at once just to get through these roadblocks. Normally, I would not support a game padding itself by forcing you to do side quests, but in context, it's quite genius what Monolith Soft was going for here. With Torna getting destroyed by Mythra, that also means that every single NPC that you encounter, on the Torna Titan at least, will die. But you probably wouldn't have cared because there were just some side characters we knew nothing about. By forcing you to do these side quests, we get to know them, even for just a bit, right before they perish at the hands of Mithra. Echoing my thoughts on Jen and Hayes, but to a smaller degree, this added interaction we get with these characters makes us appreciate them just enough for us to be sad about their inevitable death. Torna goes a step further and has many of these side quests connect to one another, where doing one for a character can lead to another quest with them, which now requires the assistance of another NPC who you have also helped, leading to that strong sense of community that this game is going for. Even if you already know the outcome of the story, you're still affected by it, because you'll be thinking about all those people you helped, who told you about their struggles, their plans for the future, their loved ones, all now gone in flames. Before wrapping up my thoughts today, I have an interesting proposition. Not exactly the most relevant one if you're watching, because if you are, hopefully you have already played through Xenoblade Chronicles 2 or never planned on doing so anyway. But what I have in mind is, Torna is a great prequel. It perfectly sets up characters you will see later down the line in the main story, has gameplay that makes it easier to jump into, and if you play this before the main game, you aren't spoiled on how Torna ends, making its ending that much more powerful. I think for anybody interested in Xenoblade Chronicles 2, they should start with Torna for all the reasons I just stated. Them having to deal with the side quest marathon is the only thing for me being fully confident in saying that you should 100% play this before the main game. You could try and explain it to them without giving away spoilers, but who knows how long their interest will last, even if you say this all has a purpose. Just a little thought I had after playing through this, and I think it's worth discussing whether it's a good idea. With that said, that's pretty much it on what I have to say about Torna. I hope you understand now how much I love this expansion, especially with how it handles this theme of character relationships, with the combat making you feel more in tandem with your blades, how it develops its characters with the interactions they do here, and especially with the community aspect, making you care about every person. This all coming together is what surprised me so much about Torna the Golden Country. Next time, I will finally go over Xenoblade Chronicles 2, and please do watch that when it comes out. But for now, just know Torna provided a golden experience worth playing through.